Stop wasting your mind, stop wasting your money, and stop wasting your life. I believe if you put these ideas into practice consistently, you'll look back in a year and be amazed at how far you've come.
You're listening to Intentionality with Paul Kempff.
Have you ever set a goal with the best of intentions, only to find yourself struggling to follow through? You're not alone. Have you ever made the decision to live a more intentional life, to live with more intentional, but then life happens and you feel the control rapidly slipping from your hands? This is more common than you think. What if I told you that the problem isn't necessarily your motivation or willpower, but your approach to intentionality itself? So in this episode, we want to start off by diving into the degrees of intentionality. Yes, I actually believe there are degrees of intentionality. I remember at school, we referred to it in Afrikaans as trappe van vergelyking. Maybe you remember it from a very long time ago. And no, this specific degree of comparison is not something I learned at school. It's not something I read in a book. I didn't even find it on the internet. And I suspect if you ask academics what they think the degree of comparison of intentional is, they might tell you something like intentional, more intentional, and most intentional. Because I think intentionaler and intentionalist just doesn't sound right. But I think my degrees of comparison for intentional is even more unique. Except I'm not the one that came up with it. Thanks to Stefan for sharing his ideas around intentionality with me and actually giving me these degrees of comparison of intentionality and the idea for the content of today's episode. Now, maybe degrees of comparison is the wrong way to think about this concept. Maybe I should rather talk about levels of intentionality. But let me give them to you first. The first one is unintentional, then intentional, and then deliberate. Now, in a year of doing IWPK and shooting 40 episodes, I've never thought about intentionality in this way. It's always been you are either intentional or you are not intentional. But it does make a lot of sense for me to bring this third level of intentionality in. You see, there's a world of difference between simply setting intentions and being deliberately intentional and strategic in your thoughts and actions. It's the difference between hoping for change and having a foolproof roadmap to create it. I believe this could very well be the key to unlocking a level of achievement and success in your life that you never thought possible. So let's start off by first defining these degrees or levels of intentionality. Firstly, unintentional is when we're not consciously choosing our actions. We're on autopilot. We're just reacting to life. Our life is characterized by unconscious actions. Intentional means we're consciously deciding what we want and are directing our actions accordingly. A life of more conscious choices and actions. And then finally, deliberate is the highest level. It's when we carefully plan and strategize to achieve specific outcomes, usually developing new skills and habits in a structured process along the way. Now, my favorite definition of intentionality that I've shared with you many times before also contains a key characteristic, I believe, of intentionality. And just to remind you of that definition, an attitude of purposefulness with a commitment to deliberate action. There's that word, deliberate again. When we are deliberate, we don't just have a vague desire or intention. We have a clear target where we're aiming at and a detailed roadmap as to how we're going to get there. Now, let's try and make this a little bit more concrete by looking at very specific examples. Let's take your career, for example. An unintentional approach would be drifting between different jobs without any clear direction. Being intentional means consciously deciding to pursue a specific career path that aligns with your values and plays to your strengths. And being deliberate would involve creating a step-by-step plan to reach your career goals. This would include things like pursuing qualifications, certifications, growing your network in a targeted way, skills development, and doing informational interviews to figure out the ins and outs of the industry you're in. The deliberate approach is so powerful because it provides a concrete roadmap. Vague intentions can be hard to stick with because it's not always clear what we want to do next. But when you have a deliberate plan with specific milestones and habits, it's easier to take consistent action when motivation is low. The structure is what keeps you going forward. Now, here's my approach to being more deliberate. This is what works for me. I think you should ask yourself a few questions to establish first and foremost where you are at this moment in your life in terms of the different levels or degrees of intentionality. So here's the first question. Are you sabotaging yourself and creating an environment that does not facilitate the growth you envision? If the answer is yes, you are unintentional in either certain aspects of your life or maybe even your entire intentional journey. The first step to becoming more intentional is always a decision. Everything starts with a decision. A decision that you have had enough. Enough of struggling. Enough of not getting what you want out of life. Enough of just letting life happen to you. The next question you need to ask yourself to determine your level of intentionality should be, are you mindfully aware of your problems or goals and constantly working at or towards them? If the answer is no, here are some steps and tips to start being more intentional on a daily basis. Start by simply doing the work. Sit down and spend some time on identifying and analyzing what matters most in your life. In fact, I want to challenge you here. I want to challenge you where you're sitting and listening to this podcast. Pick up a piece of paper and a pen, or take your phone and make some notes. Start writing down, mapping out what it is you're struggling with at the moment, what challenges you are experiencing in your life. Then come up with some solutions and interventions that will help you to stop digging the hole you find yourself in. And then set realistic and measurable goals and targets for every aspect of your life that you want to improve. I've told you in previous episodes of IWPK how intentional I am about my goals, spending time on them on a regular basis, reviewing my goals, changing them as I achieve certain levels within my goals, and even updating the goals as my life and the circumstances in my life change. And finally, stretching myself by setting beer hags, big, hairy, audacious goals that are so big they sometimes scare you a little bit. The next step is to spend time with people and listen to people, but the right people, coaches, mentors, people that you respect, podcasts, TED Talks, the right YouTube videos. All of these can be very powerful if you're listening to the right people and the right things that can help you grow. Read the right things. Read more nonfiction. Keep on studying and learning. Focus on constant improvement. Remember that principle of accretion, the law of accretion that I've spoken about so many times before. And you know what? Come to think of it, simply follow my podcast and go and listen to all of the advice my guests and I have given over the last 40 episodes on living a more intentional life. It genuinely works for me, and I can see no reason why it cannot work for you. The simple act of creating this podcast, creating the intentional content I share with you, has made me more intentional in almost every aspect of my life. And then the final question I think you should ask yourself is, are you directing your mind to create achievable goals and step-by-step plans to deliberately work at changing and shaping your life? If the answer is no, you are probably being intentional without yet being deliberate. So how do we move to the deliberate level of intentionality? I believe it is possible when your intentions become more structured, when your actions and efforts become more purposeful to improve your performance. I believe it emphasizes consistent, focused work towards very specific, very clear outcomes, and it includes regular feedback and continuous adjustment of strategies to remain on your chosen path to success. So let's look at some specific practical examples of how to move from being intentional to becoming deliberate. Intentional goals are goals you consciously choose to pursue. They represent a shift from passive or reactive living to a more proactive decision making. A good example is deciding to improve your health. So, the moment you decide to improve your health, you think about it more. You start doing things differently. Maybe you start exercising a little bit. You start eating better. You start losing weight. You go to a doctor for a health checkup. So, you've become more intentional about your health. Things are going better, but not exactly the way you want it to be yet. You still lack the discipline some days to go and do the exercise. You are allowing yourself too many cheat days with your eating habits, and those last few kilos are proving much more difficult to lose than you thought. Deliberate goals involve a much higher level of planning, strategy, and consistent effort, and they invariably require and then result in the development of habits and skills, new habits and skills. For example, creating a detailed fitness plan with specific milestones, nutrition targets, and a workout schedule to improve your fitness with an accountability partner, helping you to stay disciplined and driven to achieve your goals in an incredibly determined and deliberate way. Intentional living encourages you to make conscious choices about your life, helping you move away from autopilot mode, just letting life happen to you, to starting to align your actions with your values, desires, and goals. Deliberate living involves a more structured, purposeful approach to improve performance. It emphasizes consistent, focused work towards specific outcomes, moving from vague desires and dreams to concrete, achievable outcomes. The deliberate approach is particularly powerful for long-term complex goals that require sustained effort and strategy. Here's a quick life hack that I want to share with you. It's something I discovered that I would recommend for moving from intentional to deliberate. So whenever you find yourself facing two choices, always pick the harder one. For example, you wake up in the morning, the bed is nice and comfortable, it's a little bit cold outside, you have the choice between sleeping in or going for a run. Always choose the run. Always choose the harder option. This works because when there's a harder choice, your gut actually usually knows what the right choice is. The only reason you consider the easier choice is laziness. So recognize that impulse and consciously override it. Repeatedly choosing the higher friction option strengthens your intentionality and self-control muscles. The final part of deliberateness is accountability and letting go of blame. It's easy to waste a lot of time and mental energy stewing over past mistakes, resisting taking responsibility for aspects of your life that's just not the way you want it to be, and even worse, blaming others for the challenges and problems you experience in your life. But this keeps you stuck. Instead, acknowledge your situation, forgive yourself and others where needed, and then ask, what's the next step that I can take right now? Put your focus on the future and get into deliberate action. I want to explore this idea of levels or degrees of intentionality a lot further in future episodes. Maybe there's even a level beyond deliberate. I'm thinking about something like moving from deliberate to liberation, or something similar. But enough of that for now. Let's summarize and get to the end of this episode. I'd like to end off with 5 points that I think can help you in this journey from unintentional to deliberate. So here they are. Point number 1, get intentional by consciously choosing what matters to you. Amp things up by adding deliberate structure and strategy. 3, maintain momentum by ditching blame and always focusing on what's next. What's the next small step you can take? Number 4, stop digging when you are in a hole. And by the way, stop wasting time in getting started on that next positive step. And finally, number 5, stop wasting your mind, stop wasting your money, and stop wasting your life. I believe if you put these ideas into practice consistently, you'll look back in a year and be amazed at how far you've come. It's incredible what we are capable of with clear intentions and a deliberate effort. My quote of the week is a well-known one, with a slight twist to it. To err is human, but when the eraser wears out ahead of the pencil, you are overdoing it. My tip or recommendation of the week is a book I'm reading at the moment. It's called Deep and Deliberate Delegation by Dave Stitt. We will share the link to this book in the show notes. Now, this is something that I desperately need to do better in my life. I need to learn how to delegate better. And maybe the way for me to get better at delegation is to do an episode on delegation, on the art of delegation in the future. Maybe we can call it something like intentional delegation. Production team, please take note. Thanks for tuning in today. If this message resonated with you, we'd love to hear from you. Drop us a comment or send us a message. And until next time, stay intentional and keep taking those small, intentional, and deliberate steps to a better life.
Thanks for watching Intentionality with Paul Kempff. Subscribe, like, and click that bell to get notified when we release more episodes on how to live a life of intention and purpose.